I'm Warren Gallagher. I'm from a unit that covers BRI quite excessively. For Dr. Evans, thank you. I guess my question would be, you drew it out very well, what's going on. And certainly when we look at what happened in Sri Lanka and ownership of ports, it's a bit frightening, but in your opinion, do you see a social credit program which follows this? We see ideologies, and certainly what I'm seeing, I know Jamaica signed on to BRI a few weeks ago, but we also see the emergence of students now going to China, so the cultural aspect of the BRI is what I'm concerned about, as well as that social credit system that's more likely to follow that.
Absolutely. This is a very whole of nation approach by the Chinese. And it is everything from establishing those free trade zones, using the ports to build out the infrastructure, to look at further trading, further schooling, educational programs. There's been a huge uptick on the part of many of these countries. The students that would normally come to the United States are going to China for master's and PhD education. So we're witnessing that as part of a deliberate encouragement. So I completely see other elements more long-standing to build the kind of social relationships. I think part of it, though, has been driven because of public criticism on the part of China for using some of these agreements as a coercive, like, debt trap diplomacy. So I think part of it is a Machiavellian approach by the Chinese to show that they're being better, good neighbors to some of these countries. And I can see it ratcheting up because it's a very small price to pay for larger geostrategic ambitions.
Question for Dr. Evans as a follow-up on the Huawei discussion. The UK has had a very interesting discussion about how they're going to approach the segregation between critical infrastructure, which is government or military related, versus civilian infrastructure. And I'd like to hear your comments about how you think that will work, or whether or not it's not possible with the integrated communication systems that actually exist globally now.
Yeah, very interesting discussion in the UK, and leading and led to the dismissal of the UK defense minister. So, you know, again, economics and defense, how close a nexus is that one? I've had, you know, you can read from my bio, I have come from an Intel background and a strong C4 SRT background, and I am familiar from some of the security discussions, classifications at NSA, MI5, MI6, of the vulnerabilities of us relying on that 5G network. And yes, they exist. And it's interesting, despite the current focus on Brexit, MI5, MI6, you see more public statements now, particularly after the firing of the defense minister because of the disagreement with Prime Minister May, of the Intel community coming saying, yeah, we have absolute vulnerabilities and we should not be allowing China access to building up our 5G network. So that, I think, speaks volumes, particularly from the Intel community. And already Australia and New Zealand have banned Huawei. Within DoD, we no longer sell Huawei phones. We have put a ban on any Huawei, any of our contractors using Huawei products. So we're taking, the United States is taking a very hardline approach to Huawei, and are really pressuring our allies, particularly in Europe, with very mixed effects. For example, Italy, Spain, a number of others are pursuing Huawei 5G. So we have some fracturing there occurring as well. But again, I point to Huawei as a good example, because why would Prime Minister May fire a defense minister? And I think when she's looking at Brexit and needing trading relationships, and China being an important one, China has indirect influence in her rationale, where she's going to need important trading partners if they crash out of Brexit. So I think that whole relationship and the role of Huawei was at play, and really led to quite a schism within her national security apparatus.
Shumit Ganguly, Indiana University, Bloomington. Thanks for 3 fascinating presentations with different perspectives. But my question's for Sara. I found your argument to be both tantalizing and persuasive to some degree about the continuity in policies. but I wonder if you might consider something, and that is the very abrupt retreat from multilateralism in this administration, manifested in the withdrawal from the INF, from climate change, from NAFTA. I could give you an entire
Paris.
litany. Now, this is not entirely new because the George W. Bush administration had also withdrawn, for example, from the very robust ABM treaty, which multiple administrations, regardless of ideological coloration, had supported. But it strikes me, I think you are underplaying the degree of disruption. Okay, it's not an epochal moment like 1989, I agree with you. But I nevertheless think this does constitute a degree of discontinuity that you're not adequately emphasizing.
Okay, thank you. I was going to start by mentioning, but you did in your question, the policies of the George Bush administration, right? You correctly noted the ABM withdrawal. And indeed, it struck me just now thinking that the title or theme of this year's conference, A Changing International Order, might have been just as applicable in the years 2002 to 2005, right? So part of my thinking now is the sense that it's too soon to tell, right? You do get a sense in traveling in Europe and speaking to people as I do there, that there was a sense they can survive 4 years of this, right? 8 years, maybe not. So I think there's more developments adrift on the international economic side, as I alluded to, but I think on the international security side, we've seen elements of this before. Certainly the rhetoric has changed. It's stronger. I won't disagree with that. It's very hard to disagree with that. But NATO, as Stanley Hoffman noted, is always in crisis, right? So I think much will depend on what happens in the next 2 years.
My question is directed to Professor Moller. I was just wondering, because you were speaking about how changes in the system are not characteristic the same as changes of the system. And I guess one thing I was wondering about was if there was a kind of implicit assumption in your claim, in the sense of, like, you were saying that though the system seems to be changing, what's actually changing is our reinterpretation, and the system itself has kind of been continuous since, you know, the late 1940s and whatnot. However, one thing I was wondering was, if we kind of flip the script and take like a constructivist approach in the footsteps of Alexander Wett, and we say that rather than our interpretations being subject to the realities that already exist, you know, the international relations landscape is actually subject to our interpretations instead. So we take it like in that sense and we substitute the two. Does that change the conversation in any way? I guess that's what I'm wondering. Because I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, what would the international relations landscape be without constant reinterpretation from the, you know, the people that are subject to the decisions of actors and geopolitical actors, right? Because what you seem to be saying was that, you know, our interpretation is subject to what it is already, but I'm trying to figure out what it is like without our interpretations in the first, like how could we know what it would even be?
Great, thank you. Yeah, I would actually push back a little against your dating of the late 1940s. I tend to, perhaps it's my Danish origins, but I take a longer view of history. And I think the constructivist school would help explain this window between 1989 and 2008 or 14, whatever your end year is, right? That this was an attempt to perceive a different order, but that's my view.
Okay, so I understand the first part is the U.S. superpower status and our status of that. What was the second part again?
So you had mentioned that the U.S. is not taking an isolationist viewpoint, but that if something affects them, they would be willing to be part of an ad hoc committee. How will they decide what affects them enough to constitute creating that ad hoc committee, and what they don't think is important enough to address?
Got it. My personal opinion is that while all the trend lines go against it, that at least through the estimates right now are someplace between 20 and 30, 20 and 50, that China in many dimensions will transcend the U.S. as a regional power in Asia. if that happens, the U.S. will retain its position as a regional power in the Western Hemisphere. And my hope is that we slide on my chart a little down from the Jacksonian nationalist into the some type of more Mearsheimer than Waltz, than an offensive realist perspective or foreign policy that is not offshore balancing in the current sense. I think that we have to posture our forces forward to provide the assurance and the relationships that are necessary to continue if we're just a regional power. My assessment, however, is that China has lots of problems, and it is not going to be 2030, 2050 that their ascendance is not guaranteed. And part of what I was going to say later about the inevitability of this effort goes to the recent book on Thucydides' trap out of Harvard, that the odds are really bad when you take a look at the case studies of that transition of power. However, a lot of the outcome of that transition has everything to do with what the U.S. does with its internal politics and what China does with its internal politics. And our position in the world is going to be heavily dependent on maintaining a strong U.S. economy and somehow tempering the current political discourse in a way that we can get things done. And likewise, what's going to happen in China has a lot to do with how they're going to handle several of their demographic challenges and the way that they are perceived with a growing middle class. You can see in Hong Kong recently how a certain middle class is not too keen on ascending China. And I think that there are going to be enough downward pressures there, but it's all going to be what China does. It's going to have very little to do with what the U.S. does to frustrate those ambitions.
My name is Benjamin Hawken from the University of Glasgow. My question is for Dr. Evans about the BRI. So last year we saw China declare the Arctic as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in the Russian Northwest Passage. I was just wondering if you could comment on what you feel the increased economic trade and regional development between China and Russia could mean for their relationship. We've seen it recently be called more of an axis of convenience than a strategic alliance. I was wondering if you think that would change at all, or if it would become sort of more of a China-led venture. Thank you.
Very good question. And the Arctic is an exciting place. I understand one of your conferences was on the Arctic, and that merits a lot of attention. The Arctic is going to be, not only is it important for shortening the trade routes, particularly to Europe from China, but it's also, all about natural resources, exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. So many factors ongoing in the Arctic region, and for why China's integrating that into the Belt and Road, and I'm glad for that question. In regard to the relationship between Russia and China, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, we've seen that relationship flip an awful lot. But again, hearkening back to my point about the lack of leadership and positive engagement on the part of the U.S. right now, in countering it, I see a stronger U.S.-Russian relationship with regard to the Arctic, absolutely. And particularly as China is looking, again, Navy-wise, hardening a lot of its hull structures, its submarine deployments, thinking about the Arctic in concert with Russian forces, again, something to think about long-term. So I see a solidifying in some of those relationships.
Building on the question from the center table, I recognize the three different approaches that you lay out, the analyses of U.S. foreign policy thinking between liberal, realist, and Jacksonian, I believe, borrowing from Walter Russell Mead's analyses of U.S. foreign policy history. I was curious about your observation that somehow the Jacksonian nationalist approach might be less conflictual than the liberal approach, which I suppose contrasts with my understanding that if you're coming to a foreign policy question as a liberal, you're at least open to the idea that we might be able to frame our interests in common and then therefore develop institutions which would then mediate our various concerns, versus a Jacksonian approach which starts from the assumption that that national interests are actually different. How would defining starting from the position that our interests are different lead to less conflict than starting from the position that they're potentially common?
All right. Let me first explain that Jacksonian approach definitely started with me. That's where I got it. There is an excellent paper written by two Australians that expanded on that later in the year that develops it. So first, I guess what I need to do is kind of lay out what I see as the differences between the two, because I'm not sure that I'm tracking exactly. The biggest differences between the liberal approach and the Jacksonian approach has to do with whether it is interest-based or values-based. And the second one has to do, so the Jacksonian approach is much more pragmatic and much more realpolitik, kind of like a realist approach. The difference between it and the realist approach has a lot to do with the delivery. There is an element in the Jacksonian approach that is interested in national honor, and this theory, this perspective that's very familiar to a military leader is that your bearing has everything to do with how someone else is going to interact with you. Trump has taken that to a different level because he has a certain personality that is grounded in reality TV and New York City real estate development, and that interaction with a certain gruffness of negotiation that goes on with unions and contractors and stuff that he's brought to an international arena that complicates this. But no matter who would take on a Jacksonian nationalist view would be doing a certain amount of posturing and have a certain amount of swagger, and actually is resistant to getting into foreign interventions. But once they do it, that swagger also has a certain saving face type quality to it that makes it hard to get out. So given that view of how I see those three categories, could you kind of just get me back onto your question so I answer it from that perspective, because I just didn't understand the organ. Go ahead.
I think you've answered the question already, because you've indicated in your view that the liberal view doesn't pay attention to interests, whereas the Jacksonian does. In my view,
it's not an all or nothing. The liberal view takes on the interest and values as an organizing principle, and will do things that are not because of the long-term interest of those values, the idea of democracy and spreading democracy and the union of democracies and the spreading of capitalism and the individual rights piece are present very strongly to the liberal view. That is not the driving force of the either political ideology or values don't drive a Jacksonian nationalist. The thing that drives it is outcomes that are looked at in a more nationalist interest way. But the real pushback is there's people in both camps that understand or have different levels of that value. The difference between the tradition versus the theory. You know, there's theorists in both camps and politicians in both camps that will balance it. The thing that is a real pushback, I mean, the Jacksonian nationalists are not about intervening in other sovereign nations' domestic politics to execute change and bring on this great thing. And Trump is not the first guy that tried this. I mean, 36 years after we claimed independence from our British neighbors there, we invaded another country thinking that we were going to be welcomed with open arms, and when we got those oppressive rulers out of the way, the entire enterprise would, spread to the Arctic. It didn't work out so well for us then. I don't think the nationalists think that it'll work out well for us in the future.
I'm Mike Collins. I'm visiting from Nashville, Tennessee. I have two sort of related questions, and you've touched on some of these. When we talk about the strategy that China is employing, this major expansion across the globe, the Belt and the Road, China has its limitations. It has a capacity issue here. This expansion, we are in some way entering into an area of an economic colonialism versus one of a territorial one. In the territorial days, to enforce the colonialism was a gunboat diplomacy. Today, China is employing sometimes the bankruptcy court route. But again, there are limitations of that. What if China fails in this expansion? What if China overextends itself? What if China faces domestic policy issues or a major economic setback? What is going to happen in terms of the power vacuum that would be completed, and how realistic is a scenario like that?
I just completed a fourth iteration of a 4-year study on the U.S. in the Indo-PACOM region, and briefed the SEC Army on a U.S. posture arrangement there. So I have a little bit of experience in the region, and to answer your question.
Very dangerous.
It gets to the Commander of the Canadian Army's point that one of the things from a security perspective that we have to deal with here is the notion that we are in a persistent competition for transient advantage with China. And that means that below the threshold of war or conflict, we need to get involved in this game. And I think that we can influence the relationships we have in the region if we get a little less, if we have a little more risk tolerance to escalation with China. But in your scenario, if China fails for its own internal reasons or declines for its own internal reasons, what that's going to give us is a window of opportunity to build relationships in the region, get on with this competition through the positive side that without intervention, but moving more into the realist or liberal camp of working with partners to establish a system in which we can manage a power transition if it comes back, or address some of the challenges of the developing countries that have been frankly ignored over several years.
I take a pretty robust view of China's domestic capabilities. I think we're in a very unfair economic competition. If you look at China's, it is a state capitalist society, economy, versus ours, free market. It can direct investment. It can take the losses that it's incurring in the Belt and Road Initiative. It is using its giants like Huawei that have been directly promoted by the Chinese government to strategically impact our global critical infrastructure. And it is a very authoritarian regime with control over its society and over its economy, and can direct in ways that nowhere else in the world can be done. And it's rolling it out in style, and it's doing it very effectively. I think, as you pointed out, that at the end of the day, China's making investments in nation states, and ultimately they should have control over those assets. But what we're seeing is, because of the role of debt diplomacy, many of these countries simply don't have options, and they are being coerced into Chinese foreign policy initiatives, particularly to isolate Taiwan. And they are economically indebted. And unless we, through the IMF or World Bank, or creating we've just recently in the United States looked at an economic development bank to help some of these countries out of their debt. But it's going to take a much larger concerted effort, not just by the US, but by Europe, in order to make an effective counter. And it's going to have to be along economic means, as well as building up particularly our Navy, in order to match some of the offensive needs of the Chinese Navy, because that's happening before 2030. So I'm concerned.
I just wanted to echo Dr. Evans' point about political leadership and alternatives. Since we keep coming back to China, I just wanted to draw those of you in the room who haven't seen Peter Beinart's piece in The Atlantic, I believe it was published yesterday or 48 hours ago, about the need for, in the US, he's talking about the Democratic candidates, but it's an argument that can be applied to other countries as well, a question about alternatives to what the Trump administration policies are with regard to China, right? We need to have a national, this goes back to one of the themes, a whole of nation approach. So I commend to those of you who haven't seen it, Peter Beinart's piece.
When I hear the President of the United States admonishing Germany to limit its dependency on the oil and gas of the the Russian, I find it far less credible than when in the mid-80s George Shultz, the Secretary of State, was admonishing NATO to reduce that dependency, because in those days it was the Cold War. Right now we're more in a wall of economic integration with all the threat that you mentioned by China. But the Russia is, other than of course its nuclear capability and all that, on the international stage is a outlier in a way, but it is not really a subject of major preoccupation in terms of what the longer term threats are. So is that dependency not a bit of a fake news given the evolution in terms of alternative source of energy and all that? Isn't that a ploy to enhance the capability of the US to export oil and gas?
No, it's a real strategic weakness that NATO has long recognized, and is redressing in different types of ways. And again, this is where US leadership, we've become one of the world's largest energy exporter. If we want to fix the NATO dependency, why aren't we discussing gas supplies to Germany? We're not. But NATO is very, very concerned. It has established 2 new NATO commands, looking one at guaranteeing the Atlantic, looking at securing energy transport routes, because this is something that is being discussed at the underlying NATO DoD level, and also a new logistics base in Germany. Again, trying to use that as a means to get some harder discussion about how we can look at different types of resupply into host countries through different new pipeline projects coming on board. But there needs to be a really Argonne National Labs here. We have many different DOE labs that are very good at mapping critical infrastructure dependencies. And I'm hoping that NATO will look at some of the more rigorous capabilities from our energy labs to see how we can reroute current, particularly pipeline supplies that are very heavily dependent coming from Gazprom. And again, the Russians have definitely halted gas supplies in the past. So they have signaled their intent and willingness to use that as an economic tool.
So with the multi-polar world now, with a number of large powers, where they have effects at the regional level, and when you take in the devastation of nuclear weapons held by the large powers, and then the devastation for 5th generation conventional weapons that we have, and the size of the forces, and actually the cost of them. Even though there's great consternation over the Belt and Road Initiative, tariffs, trade wars and such, for political leaders, wouldn't that be the more opportune avenue to compete, as opposed to shooting at each other when we look at the devastation? And how can we, if that's the case, how do we become better economic players as opposed to going fisticuffs with one another?
So strictly speaking from a military perspective on this, the kind of the posture thing that I did in the Indo-PACOM area, we have got to get out of advancing the military equation through exquisite high-end systems that cost more money than we can afford. The way that we can compete and the way that we can deter and the way that we can assure our partners can be done much cheaper if we change our mental model a little bit. In the Indo-PACOM area, for instance, establishing a network of mutual agreements or bilateral agreements, if under this administration, to establish a sustainment capability and present multiple options to the regional commander without imposing huge costs would do a whole lot more than building and fielding exquisite systems in the region, so that the joint force can have a credible, sustainable pushback. The second thing is, of course, it would be better to do this economic competition and have a whole of government competition, and the military doesn't really have a huge role in that, except to stay, again, to the Indo-PACOM region specifically. I don't know NATO as well. We've been there longer, and they've got relationships and so forth. In the Indo-PACOM region, the military, particularly the Army, can do a whole lot in beginning that conversation on partnerships and relationships and where common ground is, where we could have bilateral agreements and what is needed to assure those partners cheaply. And cheaply may be a key to that, because it's a big theater with lots of stakeholders out there, and you can't do it in a robust manner and kind of get into a Belt and Road war with China.
I'm going to echo a lot of what Trey has to say, but it's a huge it's a huge must-do, and I think one of the reasons why I focused on this for today's discussion is that I don't think we've grappled with really the extent of the problem. I think we're just in its infancy. And like any good researcher, I've been banging up and down to the National Security Committee saying, and community, excuse me, to say we really need a systematic viewpoint, and we need to bring state together with DoD, with USAID, with some of our international organizations to really flush out, and I think it would be a great conference to really flush out a deliberate approach and where there are strengths, where there are gaps, where there are weaknesses, where we can make contributions. Because right now we just don't have our arms around this problem, and I think until we do, I don't want to be leading out in front with recommendations. Not trying to duck the question, but I deliberately wanted to have this as a discussion topic to get our minds thinking about how we're going to redress this as a whole effort.
Thank you.
Dr. Braun, you talked earlier, one statement you made, we talk about increasingly about competition for some countries under the threshold, and you made a statement in your initial talk. You said nuclear deterrence keeps the threshold down, and I wrote that there because I don't just wonder if you can amplify on that, because to me seems to me that nuclear deterrence probably makes this threshold higher, gives more space for countries to operate within. So I'm curious if you can expand on that.
I agree with that. I agree with your position, so I need to clarify what I said. The threshold I'm talking about is it raises the threshold for war, so the direct conflict. The thing we're not in right now is the competition, and we continue to shift off of organizing ourselves for the competition and preparing ourselves for the exquisite state-on-state war. I suspect we can't get away from the exquisite state-on-state war at some level, but we're putting much too much time and energy into that, and that will put us into that Thucydides trap prematurely, and will not allow the military as an element of the whole of government to participate in the competition below the threshold of war. We are in a coercive competition in the U.S. with China. There's no question about it. They are undermining our legitimacy and our credibility with our partners. I'm looking forward to that panel to hear how that might manifest. I'm giving you my notions here. We've got experts that are going to talk, tomorrow on that. If we don't get in that game, they have no reason to go to war with us. They will win every national interest competition piece in that realm, and they have been. Now, we can hope for an internal set of circumstances that will reverse the trend and give us some more time to figure ourselves out on how we're going to compete in that area and how we're going to build partnerships and what that new order would look like. But if China continues on the trend that we're on and we continue as a military to not reinforce or maybe jumpstart the rest of the whole of government effort in that region, we better figure out how to get back to the Monroe Doctrine and how to deal with an Asia that is run and controlled by China.
The panel has done, I think, an excellent job of linking long-term strategic ambition of China, their strategy for economics, and some have touched briefly on military developments. But in terms of the most potent military threats I think that the West faces, Russia still has quite a capacity. And we've just skipped very briefly over what Russia's intent is, what their strategic goals are, and how they are looking to compete with the West and for what purpose. So I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts about, can you tell a similar story about Russia?
So I was fortunate to be at the NATO Defense College in the fall, and as part of their senior seminar program, they had, I believe, 2 days. Dr. Mark Asawa is in the room, so you can correct me, but I believe they had 2 days on dealing with Russia. And there was a representative there from Russia who was very clear, I think, in making the case that we've seen from Putin, that they have ambitions or pretensions, maybe a better word, to be a great power, right? Their intent and strategic intent, I think, is very clear. We've seen evidence of that in the last couple of years. What worries me more about Russia is not its hardware and hard power military capacity, but this disinformation campaign and the societal tools that it has been wielding so well. And indeed, we know why they're doing that. It's because they can't compete with NATO one-on-one. So that is why it's an asymmetric approach. I see that my sense from talking and spending time in Europe is that the shift within NATO, or the divide within NATO between South and East, is very real. It doesn't get enough attention. I wish that both Brussels and other elements of NATO would confront it head on, because an alliance needs to be cohesive, politically cohesive, but also it needs to have consensus on threat assessment. And I don't think there is that in NATO right now. And while I tend to think the Russian military threat may be exaggerated, that there are other ways that they can hurt us. And in order to have that discussion, though, we first need to tackle the question of the Southeast divide in NATO.
Just a real quick thought there too. I think so much of Russia is it's about energy, but it's also about arms sales, and using arms sales as an instrument of their foreign policy. And having just come back from Turkey, where the news of the day, of course, was the S-400, and how are we going to balance that particular system? Would it go through or not? And the convolutions that are going as a consequence within NATO. So very smart move on the part of the Russians. The Turks had asked for technology and our own systems. We declined, and we led them right back into Russia. So again, I point to, we need to be a little bit more strategic in how we're treating our allies and our enemies.
This is more about the S-400 sales, more about a victory on the information plane. The greatest Russian threat to us is dividing Eastern Europe. The target is Germany, full stop. It's dividing Germany from France, Brexit, and we see this playing out. They're arming and funding parties on either side of the spectrum, in France as an example, et cetera, playing on the information plane. They're doing a great job at mitigating their own weakness and attacking ours, and moving on ways, and it's particularly appropriate as we began to study and reacquaint ourselves with Russian strategic doctrine, that we reminded ourselves that they don't have the same concept of war as we do. And they view themselves in a perpetual state of conflict, and therefore what are we doing about it? As the military professionals, looking where the comment came from, what are we doing in terms of recognizing our own strengths and weaknesses, as well as our assessment of what our adversaries are doing, and how do we support the national security architecture that comes into play? These are very important comments. Thanks. General Paul.
Could I comment on that also real quickly? Is in my study, admittedly focused on Indo-PACOM and not Europe, we identified China as the pacer and Russia as the spoiler, and that Russia is a spoiler exactly as you laid out, and that we said another indicator that Russia is not the threat that it is often made out to be is NATO's behavior toward Russia. NATO is increasingly more worried about their southern flank than their eastern flank, and they ran right up to in its expansion to the Russian border. If they thought Russia was going to be a problem, we wouldn't have done that for the perpetual war nature of the Russian psyche. And so the last thing I wanted to say about that is their economy is not going to make them something bigger than that anytime soon. So I am hoping that we get a little more Jacksonian nationalist with them and get away from the ideology and figure out a way to help Russia balance China with the United States and not be so darn ideological about dealing with a guy like Putin, where it is to our disadvantage.
My question is a little bit related to state capitalism. A few years ago when I did War College, I mean, nobody was talking about that. And I heard about it in NATO recently. Now we're still talking about it. However, the majority of the population, and I would offer to you many of our political masters, are not there yet. And I'm not sure that many leaders really understand what it's all about. We are really disadvantaged, you know, on that regard. But as well, you know, as Western societies, we're now addicted to cheap product. So how do we get out of that cycle? Do we have the will economically to disenfranchise ourselves, you know, from that dependency?
Very good questions. And again, that's why I'm making a plea. I teach a course at the War College on economics of national security. And for most of our senior military leaders, this is the first time they're in touch with some fundamental economic concepts and learning about state capitalism in China and really how we're in this unbalanced type of competition and how it's affecting all of our different relationships. So I make a plea to do, you know, more and for you to be demanding more of this type of understanding, in integrating that into your into strategy as a whole. But it's an education. We're in an educational environment, and it's going to take a lot of learning. And as I mentioned in my discussion, we're impeded by leadership right now. But I think the good news is the more that we can educate and the more we can raise awareness at your working levels, this is where the real leadership begins as you move through your careers and as you form alliances and partners and networking as you're doing today.
So a key thing to me is I do believe that the levers, the drivers in the international community are forcing a fundamental change in U.S. foreign policy. With the rise of China, we can no longer afford to continue to be a liberal hegemon and intervene around the world. And so it's going to require an adjustment. The second thing is, the answer to your question is, I don't know, you've got it nailed. I'll tell you, I'm pretty sure the answer is internal, civil, critical thinking discourse, as opposed to what we're currently living with. How to affect that or achieve that in this vitriol environment, got no idea. But my job is to write about this stuff and give it to people who are in that vitriol environment, and hope to pull them out of it to think more broadly about how we might blend these either ideological or academically based stovepipes into something that may contradict itself internally every once in a while, but actually works better.
I guess my final thought to leave you with all is perhaps a plea as an academic that as we continue the discussion today and tomorrow, to be as precise as possible about whether we're talking about change in the domestic level, U.S. foreign policy, the international order. These things are obviously related, but they change along there. They have different time horizons. And so I think as we move forward in the conference, we should be focusing on rigor and precision. Thank you.